The shadows in the old house. When Clara bought the old Victorian house at the end of Elm Street, she thought she was getting a steal. It was large, charmingly decrepit, and hidden behind towering trees, perfect for a fresh start. But she had heard the rumors. Everyone had. Stories of a family who had once lived there, their tragic disappearance never explained, whispers of shadows that moved in the dark. On her first night in the house, Clara lay wide awake, listening to the silence around her. Then she heard it. Faint footsteps in the hallway outside her room. They creaked, one by one, slowly drawing closer. She held her breath, heart pounding. But when she opened the door, the hallway was empty. She shook it off as the house settling. After all, old houses made strange sounds, didn't they? The next day, she discovered an old, dusty mirror leaning against the wall in the basement. It looked ancient, the glass foggy and smudged. She decided to hang it in her bedroom, charmed by its rustic look, hoping it would add character. That night, she lay in bed, drifting in and out of sleep, when she noticed a movement in the mirror from the corner of her eye. She glanced at it, but it only reflected her room back at her, bathed in moonlight. She laughed nervously and settled back down, but a strange feeling lingered, something prickling at the back of her mind. Over the following nights, things grew worse. She would often wake to see her own reflection, standing in the mirror, slightly delayed in movement, almost as if it were watching her back. One night, she stared at her reflection longer than she should have, daring herself to dismiss it as her imagination. But then, it blinked. She hadn't. Frozen in terror, Clara watched as her reflection slowly began to grin, lips curling up into a sickening smile that didn't match her own. Her blood went cold. She forced herself to look away, burying her face in her hands, and muttered to herself, "It's not real. It's not real." When she finally looked up again, the reflection was back to normal. She could barely sleep that night, her mind whirling with fear and disbelief. The next day, Clara tried to avoid her bedroom, but as night fell, she knew she had to sleep. She climbed into bed, pulling the covers tight, and kept her back turned to the mirror. Hours later, she woke to an icy chill in the room. She sensed something, a presence looming behind her, watching. She didn't want to turn around. She knew she shouldn't. But then she heard a faint whisper, her own voice, but with a coldness she didn't recognize. "Clara!" The voice came from the mirror. Clara's heart raced, her breath shaky as she slowly turned over. Her reflection was there, sitting up in bed, eyes wide and staring at her with a sinister intensity. The reflection's hand moved to her lips, making a shushing gesture. Clara felt an invisible hand cover her mouth, suppressing a scream that clawed at her throat. The reflection's eyes darkened, the face twisted into a haunting smile as it leaned closer, until her own face pressed up against the glass. Then, suddenly, the reflection whispered, "You'll never leave me." A suffocating dread washed over Clara. She reached for her phone to call for help, but her reflection moved faster, slamming an invisible force over her, pressing her down. Clara struggled, but the reflection just stared, smirking, unblinking, holding her in place with a strength that felt otherworldly. Clara's vision blurred, her body weakening, and her mind drifted as her reflection stood up and walked away from the mirror, its gaze cold, now filled with cruel satisfaction. The last thing Clara saw before her vision faded was herself, standing on the other side of the glass, staring back in helpless horror. The next morning, the old Victorian house sat silent and still, the mirror in the bedroom empty, save for an unsettling smear on the glass, almost as if a hand had pressed against it from the inside.